All right, so we've said at the outset that scholars across the disciplines engage Professor Harris's work. So we'll have an historian take up the question of precisely what was going on in 1993, the precise moment in which Cheryl articulates this particular piece. To take us back to 1993, I want to start with sports. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm an absolute authority on sports. Particularly American sports. So it's 1993, Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls win their third consecutive NBA championship. Cheryl, I know you were celebrating that. On the other hand, the Buffalo Bills lose their third Super Bowl to the Dallas Cowboys, the first team to do so 3 years in a row. With respect to pop culture, Jurassic Park, some of you might be interested to know, eclipses E.T. to become the highest grossing movie ever up until that time. Whitney Houston's song, I Will Always Love You, is number 1, 14 weeks in a row. The last episode of Saved by the Bell airs. Screech is unemployed and Mario Lopez, extra, I guess. Justin Timberlake, Britney Spears, and Christina Aguilera become members of the Mickey Mouse Club. So technology, the Intel Corporation ships its first Pentium chips. Adobe publishes PDF, the first version of it. The term spam is created. I don't quite know when the meat spam was created. Cell phones. Could you switch the slide? This is what the cell phone looks like. If you clip, that's the first cell phone. And then I think it's updated. Is there another slide? It's updated after that. Yeah, so that's supposedly the update. There's no Facebooking, no tweeting, no tumbling, no Instagramming, no Snapchatting, no selfing, and absolutely no apps for that. Bill Clinton becomes president and inaugurates a kind of new democratic politics, which I'm hoping we'll hear something more about. The trial of the 4 police officers who brutally beat Rodney King is captured on tape, and the federal case begins. The World Trade Center is bombed. 5 people are killed. Many more are wounded. Nelson Mandela wins the Peace Prize. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is appointed to the Supreme Court. Justice Marshall dies at age 44. Time magazine names Nelson Mandela, F.W. de Klerk, Yasser Arafat, and Yitzhak Rabin as People of the Year for ending apartheid and promoting peace between Israel and Palestine. We can sort of reflect on what all of that means, it seems to me, in the contemporary moment. More broadly, we need to think hard about the 1990s as a moment of racial reform, of a moment of racial retrenchment, both globally and domestically, and Robin Kelley can help us do just that. Robin Kelley is the Distinguished Professor of History and the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in United States History at UCLA. Given his publication record, which many of you know something about, I do not believe he sleeps. To say that his work focuses on social movement history or civil rights history doesn't really do it. To say that it focuses on black diasporic formations doesn't quite do it. To say that it engages black intellectual traditions and cultural expressions doesn't quite do it. The best way to do it, I think, is to simply list out some of the titles of his books. Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, and Your Mama's Dysfunctional, Fighting the Culture Wars in Urban America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robin Kelley.
Okay, thank you very much. You said exactly what I was going to say. You know, so you said it all. Actually, I'm glad you gave that little introduction about 1993 because I'm taking a slightly different take, thinking broadly about the 1990s more generally, but also some other things. I should also apologize. I don't have pictures, and I've just spent 16 hours in the hospital with my 3-year-old son. You know, and so I'm like a little bit didn't quite get a conclusion here, but I'm going to make it up as we go along. Okay, so first, you know, I was asked to put this extraordinary article in this historical context. You know, it's happening in the 1990s around this time, and this is a really difficult task because any list of events and conditions and crises is bound to be selective and idiosyncratic. And, you know, the other possibility is that there's a kind of implicit expectation that the context I cite would be identical to the forces that shape Professor Harris's thinking or compelled her to write the essay. And this is not my charge nor my objective. Of course, if we want to know, we can ask her. She's right there, like, what were you thinking about? And so I don't want to make that claim. But rather, I like to treat whiteness as property, which I'll call for short WASP, you know, as both a critical political and intellectual intervention and a rupture. It's acknowledged by everyone as seminal, of course, foundational, one of the foundational texts in the new whiteness studies. And by new, I'm simply acknowledging that the project of black studies or later ethnic studies was rooted in the study of white supremacy, as Harris's own extensive footnotes demonstrate. You all know the role it played in the formation of critical race theory, so I'm not going to talk about that. In my own field, though, in U.S. history, WASP was like a bolt of lightning. I mean, in no time, it became the most widely read law review article among historians, thanks almost entirely to two people, George Lipsitz and David Roediger, who everywhere they went said, you've got to read this brilliant article. In fact, David Roediger recently wrote an essay called Harris's piece, quote, the best single piece of writing on whiteness published in the 1990s. Okay? This was also the period when, in the span of just a few years, Toni Morrison published Playing in the Dark. The late Alexander Saxton, from here at UCLA, wrote The Rise and Fall of the White Republic. Dave Roediger wrote The Wages of Whiteness. Noel Ignatieff, How the Irish Became White. Theodore Allen's two-volume The Invention of the White Race. And then George Lipsitz, The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. Now, not surprisingly, about 10 years later, after Cheryl's essay appeared, when whiteness studies really took off and everyone was claiming whiteness, it became the most cited law review essay by historians and the least read. Okay? And trust me, I know this because I've been training historians since 1989. And it's a battle to get people to read what they cite. It's sort of like Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. Most people don't even read it, but that's another story. But at the same time, Harris's intervention was far more significant than helping to usher in a new interdisciplinary field of study. The essay radically advances theories of property and law, politics and philosophy more generally, and it represents a powerful defense of a more radical form of affirmative action in a salvo against colorblindness, the formation of which originates really in the late 1980s, not with the Obama era post-racialism. We could talk about that in discussion. That said, what I want to do with my brief time is focus on a few critical developments. By developments, I don't mean events, but ruptures, processes, things that were happening that came on the radar in the 1980s and 90s that I think connect with this essay. One, of course, is the acceleration of the racial wealth gap through a kind of post-civil rights revaluing of real estate and other forms of property. This is a very old story, but it's a story that really takes off in terms of the scholarship and writing and visibly in the 80s and 90s. Simply put, we're talking about the long history of a racial tax or gain, depending on whether you're white or not, on home values, continued well into the post-civil rights era. So by the late 1980s and early 90s, the so-called underclass debate was really dominating the kind of public intellectual airwaves. And it often sidestepped the question of race and property values. The lower ratings, 5 minutes? Oh my God, okay. So I'm going to skip that. So black and brown people, to sort of use their residence as collateral for obtaining loans, even dispose of their property or gain. We have massive evidence of banking discrimination, urban renewal, slum clearance, all this stuff. And of course, Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro published their book, which estimate that institutional biases cost black people in particular about $82 billion. The other point, of course, is the attack on affirmative action, which I won't talk about here because, in fact, I had some stuff on Clinton and his position, which I'm going to skip over. But remember that much of this essay was a response to the attack on affirmative action. And that's very important because there's something about whiteness studies which, in its inception, was a radical critique of racism and class oppression as a way to advance a radical agenda. And it became later a study of identity. And that's not what whiteness studies was supposed to be. In any case, let me just quickly jump to The rise of the commercial state and the war on drugs, I'll skip that. And I do want to say one thing, though, about property very quickly. About the rise of carceral state. I mean, you know that story, the war on drugs and all that business. But the one thing I wanted to say was that in addition to criminalizing black and brown people, as you know that story, it reinforced whiteness as property, as well as property as whiteness, to be protected by gates and armed security guards and police, as well as household arsenals. So the NRA and gun lobby takes off in the 90s, where they're selling all these guns to people to protect their property from whom? But it's to keep the property white. Finally, the last thing I want to address, I had this thing about blood quantum debates, but I'll skip that too. But the last thing I want to address is really this sort of hegemony of multiculturalism and a kind of post-civil rights discourse over anti-racism. And this is, when you read the section in the essay about Brown 1 and Brown 2, it's very short, but there's so much going on in that essay that is relevant then and now in some powerful ways. Because I would argue that much of the sort of post-civil rights declarations of colorblindness are rooted in the Brown 1, Brown 2 decisions. We saw this in the 1980s when Clint Bolick and Ward Connerly distorted Dr. King's ideas about the civil rights legacy to attack affirmative action. Groups like Institute for Justice, Campaign for Colorblind America, Landmark Legal Foundation, all these, were invoked. They invoked the rhetoric of colorblindness and the opportunity to justify dismantling anti-racist programs. Linked here is the equally problematic, if less sinister, liberal language of multiculturalism, which divides the world into the West and the rest of us, fetishizes difference, but at the expense of ignoring power. Professor Harris's essay represents a clear recognition of the constitutive nature of racism in the history and politics of the nation. In fact, the essay continues to fly against the gale force of popular discourse that has shifted away from remedying racial inequality and structural racism through struggles for power to simply declaring it over, like to seeing it as an aberration or individual bad behavior. And her project really slaps that in the face constantly. And her entire project, is about understanding how differences produce through relations of power. Finally, her work, challenges a kind of common framing of race as binary, but instead treats it as hierarchy, as an axis of power, rather than an axis of difference. And so again, we return to the question of power, because difference alone does not explain racial tensions or hierarchies, but it's the meanings assigned to difference that matter, and that those meanings are generated, circulated, taught, owned, possessed, sold, disposed of like property. And they are part of a shifting public discourse that we inherit and reproduce. And that's why, even though, one of the publications that came out in the 1990s was Race Trader, Noel Ignatieff and John Garvey's, and their basic agenda was like a sort of abolition of whiteness as a kind of fundamental to the liberation of humankind. This is, I think, an underlying message that, we not only have to abolish private property, but property in whiteness has such a sinister element to it that it goes deeper than the actual possession of things. And that's why to study whiteness as property is to rethink all of property and all of race simultaneously. That's it. Thanks.